Welcome. We're here this morning to welcome Mahri Leonard Fleckman in her new volume, Scribal Representations and Social Landscapes of the Iron Age Shephelah. We have an opportunity to do another Unbound book review for the Catholic Biblical Association. I am Dr. Archie Wright, the Executive Director of CBA. And we are here today with a great panel. One of our panelists is going to present her review in a recorded video, Rachelle Gilmour. Rachelle Gilmour is the Bromby Associate Professor of Old Testament at Trinity College at the University of Melbourne. She earned her PhD in Old Testament Hebrew Bible at the University of Sydney and completed her postdoctoral research at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the University of Edinburgh. She currently serves on the editorial boards for the Journal of the Study of Old Testament and the Library of Hebrew Bible and Old Testament series for T&T Clark. She has published 3 monographs, Divine Violence in the Book of Samuel for Oxford University Press, Juxtaposition and the Elisha Cycle for T&T Clark, and Representing the Past, a literary study of narrative historiography in the Book of Samuel for Brill. Our second panelist, Jonathan Schmidt-Swartz. Jonathan Schmidt-Swartz is a scholar of Hebrew Bible whose research examines how scribes engaged inherited texts as pliable resources for navigating political and ideological uncertainty. Rather than treating tradition as fixed, these writers reassembled prior materials to reflect on changing configurations of power, legitimacy, and collective identity. He earned his PhD from NYU's Scribal Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies, his BA summa cum laude from Cornell University in Religious Studies and Comparative Literature with minors in Near Eastern Studies and Jewish Studies. And he pursued further study in Bible, philosophy, and modern Jewish thought at the University of Cambridge. His dissertation, Fabricating Labor, Kingship, Authority, and Textual Politics of Judean Scribes with NYU in 2025, shows how labor functioned not merely as an economic concern, but as a conceptual medium for thinking politically. Biblical texts associated with monarchy do not eliminate contradiction, they preserve it. Through tension, ambiguity, and reuse, scribes constructed compositions capable of sustaining competing visions of governance and obligation. Integrating close reading and intellectual history, Jonathan's work contributes to the broader conversations in humanities about how texts produce meaning under constraint, how they register ideological struggle, and how literary traditions can serve as sites of reflection on authority, memory, and political life. Our third panelist, Tawny Holm. Tawny Holm earned her PhD in Hebrew Bible and Northwest Semitic languages from the Johns Hopkins University in 1997. Tawny's main research areas are the Hebrew Bible in its ancient Near Eastern context, early Judaism, and Aramaic studies, including Aramaic language, Aramean religion, and culture. She is the author of Couriers and Kings, the Biblical Daniel Narratives, and Ancient Story Collections for Eisenbrauns, an Aramaic literary text soon to appear in the Society of Biblical Literature series, Writings from the Ancient World. Other projects include a monograph on the ancient Aramaic literature generally, forthcoming from De Gruyter. She is also editing the Handbook of Religions in the Ancient Near East for Oxford University Press, which is forthcoming. These are just a few of the many things that Professor Holm has her hands in the ancient world. Our author today, Mahri Leonard Fleckman, is the new Associate Professor of Hebrew Bible at Princeton Theological Seminary. She previously taught at the College of the Holy Cross, Providence College, and the University of Scranton. Mahri received her PhD and MPhil from New York University in Hebrew Bible and the Ancient Near East, and also has her MDiv from Union Theological Seminary in New York. Some of Mahri's previous publications include The House of David, Between Political Formation and Literary Revision from Fortress, co-author in the Book of Ruth in the Wisdom Commentary series, and co-editor of A Community of Peoples from Brill in 2022. But today we are here to talk about her latest book, Scribal Representations and Social Landscapes of the Iron Age Shephelah, published by Oxford University Press in 2025. So Mahri, it's so good to have you here. I'm going to turn it over to you now to give us a brief description of your book and your comments, and then we'll turn to our panelists. So thank you for being here, Mahri.
Thank you so much, Archie. So I want to first extend my gratitude to the CBA, to Archie Wright and Joshua Scott in particular for hosting this event. And I also want to express my deep thanks to Tawny Holmes, Rachelle Gilmour, who's fast asleep, I assume, in Australia, and Jonathan Schmidt-Swartz for so generously giving of your time and your energy in reading this book and preparing your comments and being part of the discussion. It's a true honor and a gift to have this kind of intensive, thoughtful review session and to be able to discuss scholarship and ideas meaningfully with those whose work I admire. So thank you very much. And I'll also just thank anyone who has joined this discussion online. I hope that it gives you all something meaningful to think about. So in these opening remarks, I want to talk a little bit about what this book is about, some of its key components, and also provide some insight into my own process in coming to the topic, or what's really at the heart of this project. And that's where I'll begin. So with the heart of the project, which emerged from my struggle, or our struggle as biblical scholars and historians to reconstruct the deep past given the limitations of our evidence. The book explores the tension that comes from trying to understand or to touch what was really real in the past from the patchwork evidence that we have. The written evidence that includes biblical texts, extra-biblical texts, epigraphic evidence, and of course, archaeological remains. A number of questions underlie the project. What are the limits of historical reconstruction based on the evidence we have and the methods we use? How do we deal with what is unresolved or indeterminate? And what are our responsibilities as scholars and how we work with the evidence to reconstruct or represent the past? And what does it even mean to be responsible or ethical as scholars of the distant past? So in other words, what and who exactly are we responsible to? The past, the present, what communities or people? So while these are the questions and the struggles that undergird the project, the actual focus of the book is identity in the Iron Age ancient Israel, or what we call the Southern Levant. And as the title of the book suggests, I concentrate on a particular region. Let's see if I can bring it up right now. Can you all see that? Yeah. So I concentrate on a particular region of the Iron Age Southern Levant, the Shephelah, which translates literally as lowlands of ancient Israel. This was the region in southwest ancient Israel. It kind of includes the two kind of middle-ish orange colors on the map. So it sloped westward from the central hill country of ancient Judah or Israel and toward the Mediterranean, eventually connecting with the coastal plain, which was home of the so-called Philistines in the Iron Age. This region is one of the most heavily excavated regions in the world, and it's the subject of fierce debates of how to classify people in the Iron Age when it thrived. Were they Israelite, Judahite, Philistine, Shephelite? Interpretations vary widely and are site and date specific. Archaeologists have the most secure evidence for this region, but archaeological interpretations also depend on biblical texts for things like names and categories, dates, which means that biblical scholars are crucial conversation partners as texts are used to interpret the remains. So in the book, I focus on two places in the region. These are the two little places with the little black dots that are have both reputable archaeological evidence and interpretations, and also evidence about people and social groups in biblical texts. So that's Gath or Tel es-Safi and Timnah or Tel Batash. The book examines the evidence from these two Iron Age sites, from archaeological evidence to biblical texts, from the book of Joshua, the Samson narratives and the book of Judges, and stories of David and Gath in the books of Samuel. And I also look at the Assyrian royal annals, and I also explore throughout the book how a much later scribe, 1st century CE Jewish Roman historian Josephus, represents this region in his own reworking of texts of earlier traditions. My main argument, and I'll go ahead and stop sharing the screen. My main argument is that identities in this region were complex and they defy easy categorization. People are portrayed or represented in different ways based on the aims of the authors, often from much later perspectives. This diversity of representations resists a single or simplistic meta-narrative of the past, and it's more akin to looking at a mosaic of views, or what I call a mosaic of authorship. So in the end, the question of who is who in this place and time remains unresolved. But most importantly for my work, I propose that this, I call it irresolution or indeterminacy, is not necessarily a problem for historical investigation. We like to have clear answers and arguments as scholars. This is what we're trained to do. But to be unresolved can itself be a strong argument and an ethical stance when it's used with methodological precision and rigor to clarify the limitations of the evidence. Irresolution allows us to hold open ongoing questions, to be measured and careful about our evaluations, including what's not fully known or clear. And in my view, to allow ourselves to be unresolved, whether as scholars or just human beings living in this world, is a countercultural stance. It's to help promote complex thinking over either or answers, stereotypes, in-groups, out-groups, and even vilifications of positions or people we deem to be other. So that's the heart of the project. I'd like to shift now for a few minutes before I conclude to discuss two key components of this project, which will also provide some insight into the current state of the field of Hebrew Bible in how we think about historical questions and the limits of reconstruction. I should also say that this book is my second kind of major, single-authored scholarly project, and it was born out of my own process as a younger scholar to reflect critically on my training, the methods that I use, and what really matters to me. So these kind of two components of the project are part of this critical evaluation. The first concerns my training in historical methods, or what we call historical critical work as biblical scholars. Historical critical is an umbrella term for a variety of tools that investigate the development of biblical texts over time, from the idea or the question of different sources to their contexts and histories of composition, to how they were preserved, developed, edited, reshaped, etc. These historical critical methods emerged in German circles in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and they swept the field. Eventually, they resulted in a schism in the mid-20th century that has since, in my view, grown wider between those who practice historical critical methods, which is an increasingly smaller circle of mainly North American, European, Israeli scholars, and those who do not. Now, there are many reasons that historical critical methods have come under fire in the field and are even now considered obsolete in some circles. We could talk about that more, later on in this panel if you'd like. But for one, these methods have evolved very little since the early 1900s and in light of many discoveries and developments in the field, which is a big problem. Many of us who use these methods also lack critical self-reflection on the problems inherent in the practices, those in light of ongoing developments, but also because of the anti-Jewish and anti-Catholic spaces in which historical critical methods emerged in the first place. So I was trained in these methods. They have value for me as a historian. So in this book, I try to examine them critically, including their limitations, by performing them or utilizing them in order to explore how we can continue to embrace them while also working to transform these methods. So the methods themselves, historical critical methods, are the first component of critical evaluation in the book. The second component concerns the Iron Age and what it means to be a historian of the Iron Age using biblical texts. The Iron Age is the period in which Israel emerged according to extra-biblical witnesses, the Merneptah Stela, and developed in the land. This period covers roughly 1200 to the 580s BCE, is also the First Temple period. It concludes with the destruction of Jerusalem and waves of exiles to Babylon or southern Iraq. While we used to date many texts to the Iron Age, it's become increasingly apparent that much of scribal production and the development of actual physical texts happened after this period, whether in Babylon, ancient Iraq, the Persian period Yehud, Hellenistic Judea, Alexandria, Egypt, or elsewhere. Considering these developments in dating, not to mention our first real witnesses to biblical texts that date to the Hellenistic period with the Dead Sea Scrolls, the whole relevance of the Iron Age for biblical scholars and historians of the Southern Levant has become a question. Are there actual biblical traditions that go back this far? If so, how do we begin to uncover them and use them historically when they were certainly edited, redacted, reshaped in much later periods and from later interests and concerns? Now, I care about the Iron Age. I have a stake in the fact that our biblical witnesses say something about this important period that's not all later or fiction, some might even say. But I also know the limitations of using biblical text to reconstruct Iron Age history. So the whole issue of the Iron Age is the second key component of the project and my own kind of critical evaluation alongside the methodological questions of historical practices. I think that's enough of an introduction for now. I will close just by stating briefly how wonderful it's been to be engaged in this project in a community of scholars who think and struggle over similar issues. And I have many dear colleague friends who I thank in the introduction of the book. The circle continues to grow in my life, who are always willing to read drafts, discuss issues, critique ideas in helpful and insightful ways. So I'm really grateful to have this community, some of whom I think might be, in this on this live feed right now. And again, I'm grateful for this space and these other wonderful colleagues to continue the conversation. So thank you.
Mahri, thank you so much. Those were really helpful introduction, and the questions that you raise in the book are really important questions about our method and our historical critical method in particular. So we're now going to turn to Rachelle Gilmour, who has prepared a video recording. So I'm going to turn it over to Joshua to play that for us. So Joshua.
I'm Rachelle Gilmour from Trinity College in Melbourne. I'm very sorry not to be able to join you live at this review event as it's the middle of the night here in Australia. But it is a great privilege to record a few words about Mahri Leonard Fleckman's excellent new book, Scribal Representations and Social Landscapes of the Iron Age Shephelah. Around 40 to 50 years ago, a divide took hold in our discipline between maximalist and minimalist interpretations of biblical historiography. The Iron Age was at the center of this debate as scholars started to ask, did King David really exist? What were the beginnings of early Israel, and so on? However, for all their differences, maximalists and minimalists built their methodologies on the same way of thinking: certainty, resolution. Either certainty in the positive historical truth of the Bible or in the fiction of the Bible. And the so-called objectivity of archaeology was harnessed for both cases. And moving forward to maybe 20 years ago, the judicious weighing of archaeological evidence and biblical analysis suggested both minimalist and maximalist positions are untenable. Moreover, interdisciplinary engagement in the field of history has highlighted history's reconstructive nature. All history is representation. It's subjective and says as much about the people who write it as the history that is its subject. A consensus has arisen that there must be a middle ground between minimalism and maximalism, especially in history of the Iron Age. The biblical texts have historical value, but it also has its own agenda and complicated textual history that shapes or distorts its historical representation. Archaeology, too, is of course subject to interpretation and unable to answer some of our most pressing questions. Now, in the last 20 years or so, there has been little methodological reflection on historical inquiry in our field, in historiography. Our field has given up on maximalist and minimalist meta-narratives and the idea that biblical texts might have a meta-narrative. But this is where it's been left. In particular, and this is key, I think, very few of us have given up on our own meta-narrative, at least as far as historical inquiry goes. Very few historians working with biblical texts and the Iron Age Levant are willing to give up the idea of a unified answer to questions like, who are the Philistines? Who were Judah during the Iron Age? And how do these peoples interrelate? So here enters Leonard Fleckman's work, Scribal Representations. This is a beautifully written book, but like any important work, it's actually quite difficult to read and sum up in a review because it overthrows many basic assumptions guiding the scholarly enterprise. And this includes the historian's search for a meta-narrative about the Iron Age peoples of the Shephelah. First and foremost, Leonard Fleckman suggests that all history is construction. Not reconstruction, but construction or creation. The historian does not reach for a meta-narrative or unified presentation, but rather a fluid and fragmented reality. This is not about deconstruction, throwing our hands up, we can't know anything. This approach is all about knowing. It's about seeking out the historical past. And Leonard Fleckman's innovation is focus on the limits of our knowing. The biblical texts are sites of contestation and negotiation. And for the most part, the portrayals of peoples and places in the Shephelah are from a Judahite perspective, whatever Judah itself might be. And it's a view of their proximate other, those in a liminal space through whom Judah have constructed aspects of their own identities. Thus, Leonard Fleckman's work advocates, what if we start to think of uncertainty, or irresolution as she terms it, not as a hindrance to historical construction, but as a tool, even a primary tool? If texts and objects are partial and fragile, if identities in the real world are characterized by fragmentation and contestation, then irresolution is a tool for resisting the imposition of a meta-narrative on the people of the Shephelah, reaching for the Iron Age past with an awareness and acknowledgement of the extent of what we know. So to illustrate, I'll focus my remaining comments on one chapter of Leonard Fleckman's work, Women as Landscapes. This chapter captures what to me is one of the most important and honestly really exciting aspects of this approach. All history is construction, so the historian chooses what and whom they wish to construct. The historian can, and I'd suggest ethically should, include marginalized groups, often overlooked in androcentric, Judah-centric approaches. Thus, in this chapter, Leonard Fleckman considers women and the stories of Samson in Judges 13 to 16, with some comparison to Tamar in Genesis 38. These women have been studied extensively in literary and feminist approaches to biblical texts, but as far as I know, this is the first work to stop to consider these women in historical inquiry. In Judges 13 to 16, Leonard Fleckman's reading acknowledges the grotesque treatment, the anonymity, the deletion of these women of Timnah in Judges 13 to 16. She argues these women are, and I quote, not subjects, but geographical markers of a socially perplexing area. They are the spaces in which others converge and interact, the loci of activity for social intermingling and for unusual, often sexual activity. Thus, Samson's wife in Judges 14 to 15 and Delilah in Judges 16, I quote again, underscore geographical liminality and function as spaces that others struggle to control. Leonard Fleckman groups these figures as women. She accepts that these women, I quote again, function in different ways and with varying degrees of agency. But nevertheless, they share a similar place in the narrative. It's on this point that I wish to probe Leonard Fleckman's analysis, suggesting her own methodology might be pushed further. What Leonard Fleckman's work does for peoples in the Shephelah, refusing the biblical designation of Philistine, resisting false closure, this might also be done for gender, or more precisely, women in these texts. So can we speak of women any more than we can of Philistine identity? And can a category of women be pitted against men and their games of masculine domination that are pervasive in the Samson story? The account of woman as social landscape is most convincing in the case of Delilah. She dwells in the Sorek Valley, a Nachal, which is moving, fluid, and unbound. And Delilah does not sell sex as she so often appears in her reception history, but she does sell information. Delilah is unattached to a household. She has no kinship loyalties, and she chooses to act in the way that is most beneficial, as it turns out financially, to herself. Samson's wife is portrayed quite differently. The kinship bond between her and her father, the Timnite, is unbroken by her marriage to Samson. And his life is used as leverage when the Philistines ask her to coax her husband. Her vulnerability is not economic like Delilah. It's related to her ongoing responsibility to her father's house in Timnah. She's, you might say, one with the household that Samson has gone to meet in Timnah. Moreover, when the Philistines wish to sever the kinship bond with Samson, generated by her marriage to Samson, they have to kill the woman, his wife, and her father. If this woman is liminal, her father, the Timnite, is liminal with her. She's not just a device to coax Samson through his uncontrolled desire. She's part of the patrimonial network through which neighbors, Samson and the Philistines, could make sense of their relations to each other in interwoven genealogies. Another place the unified presentation of women is broken down is in the final scene of the Samson story, where he is called before the Philistine lords to entertain them. According to Judges 16:27, in this scene, the house was full of men and women. And further on the roof, there were about 3,000 men and women who die with Samson when he brings down the building. These women are spectators rather than landscapes, perhaps, watching on, killed with the men with whom they're inextricably entangled and whose games they participate in. Gender, just like the identity of Shephelah peoples, is fragmented, resisting a meta-narrative. Leonard Fleckman's historical work is all the richer for having considered women as a category, and this too can be enhanced, I think, by the tool of irresolution. In sum, Scribal representations is a delightful exploration of the Shephelah and the people called Philistines in biblical texts. Just as importantly, though, it's a reflection on knowing in history, in our discipline, an experiment in what happens when we move beyond meta-narratives of history and accept the invitation of the mosaic of texts that we have before us.
Well, our thanks to Rachelle for recording these very helpful comments on the volume. We now turn to Jonathan Schmidt-Swartz for his comments. Jonathan?
Thank you to the CBA for convening this conversation, and thank you especially to Mahri Leonard Fleckman for a great job to think about it. It's a privilege to engage her scribal representation social
Excuse me, Jonathan. Your camera
Landscapes of the Iron
doesn't
Age
seem to be
Shephelah.
working.
From the very first pages. Sorry?
Now it's caught up. Thank you very much. Please continue.
Okay. From the very first pages, reframes what it means to do history with these fragmentary and often recalcitrant sources. As she puts it, quote, hello? Sorry about that. I don't know why I got thrown off of Zoom, but you can all see and hear me now?
We can.
Okay, so as I was saying, as she puts it, quote, irresolution can be a powerful tool in the writing and representation of history. All historians live in the land of the subjunctive, the space of wish and possibility and doubt, end quote. That line captures both her methodological courage and her ethical stance. The Shephelah in her telling is not a stable border that defines Israel over against Philistia or Judah. It is an entangled landscape where identities shift and blur, where, quote, contradictions, fragmentations, and adjunctions, end quote, are built into the very fabric of the record. And rather than treating that instability as a problem, Leonard Fleckman insists it is precisely what allows us to see the creativity of scribes, the subjectivity of archaeology, and the precariousness of our own reconstructions. What I want to do in response is to affirm that vision and to sharpen it further. If Leonard Fleckman teaches us that irresolution is our practice, that we must work within a state of attentive suspense, I would add that the scribes themselves cultivated contradiction. The seams and tensions are not only limits for us to navigate, but part of the way the texts themselves preserve multiple, even competing pasts. We cannot know the inner intentions of ancient scribes, but the textual form itself, its seams, duplications, and juxtapositions of opposites, suggests a practice of preservation that resists closure. Whether by design or by inertia, the effect is the same. Multiple paths endure side by side. In that sense, her invitation to embrace irresolution meets my own sense that these texts were crafted to preserve contradiction as a mode of survival. If we begin there with Leonard Fleckman's invitation to embrace irresolution, the first tension to name is the tension built into the very practice of historical critical work. As she reminds us, the fragments we inherit, whether potsherds or prose, cannot give us a single verifiable picture of the past. Archaeology offers traces without voices. Texts offer voices without secure context. Our reconstructions are always tentative, always subjunctive. For Leonard Fleckman, this is not a failure, but a method. To live in irresolution is to resist false certainty, to honor complexity, and to recognize that history is less about fixed recovery than about what she calls present reenactment, the act of bringing fragments into new life through interpretation. This is an enormously important methodological and ethical stance, but I want to push it one step further. The contradictions that unsettle us as historians are not only the result of gaps in our evidence, they are part of the design of the texts themselves. The scribes who shaped these works did not erase tensions, and whether by intention or inertia, they did preserve them. They joined fragments already shaped by earlier hands without smoothing their edges. The result is a literature where seams, duplications, and paradoxes function as what we might call a technology of memory. Strategies, whether conscious or not, by which contradiction itself becomes a medium of endurance. Consider the narrative arc of Samuel and Kings. For decades, scholars divided these narratives into pro-monarchic and anti-monarchic strands, as if the scribes themselves had chosen sides. But the text resists that sorting. Kingship is celebrated as divinely ordained and condemned as a disaster. David is at once the chosen king, bearer of Yahweh's promises, and the compromised ruler whose reign nearly collapses under its own contradictions. A figure who embodies a kind of polyphony, what Bakhtin would describe as the refusal of a single authoritative voice. The narrative does not reconcile those betrayals. It holds them together. What this shows us is that irresolution is not simply a problem for modern historians to manage. It is a compositional practice of the scribal communities themselves. By preserving contradiction, whether through conscious choice or through the inertia of compilation, the text gained flexibility, able to speak across different times and circumstances. So I would affirm Leonard Fleckman's call to embrace irresolution and at the same time stretch it further. We embrace it not only because our evidence is fragmentary, but because our sources were deliberately crafted to resist closure. Irresolution is not just our method, it was their art. That brings me to the second question. If irresolution is the tension of historical work, the next challenge is how we speak about identity. Leonard Fleckman is clear. We cannot treat categories like Philistine, Israelite, or Judahite as stable or self-evident. She instead turns to the language of entanglement and communities of practice. That reframing allows us to see that the Shephelah was not a border separating neat groups, but a zone of crossing where affiliations and practices overlapped. The texts themselves bear this out. Ittai the Gittite, a foreigner, is remembered as David's most loyal ally. Samson, an Israelite leader, is defined as much by his entanglements with Timnite and Philistine women as by his deeds. For Leonard Fleckman, these figures are not anomalies, but reminders that in the Iron Age, belonging was fluid, relational, and situational. That insight is crucial because it resists the temptation, still very present in modern discourse, to retroject our own national or ethnic categories into the past. But I want to push her insight one step further. The multiplicity we see in these texts is not simply the residue of lived experience. It is also a scribal construction. The scribes curated multiplicity. They staged entanglement. They set contradictory images side by side, whether consciously or simply through the practice of textual reuse, in ways that ensured identity itself remained contested. The story of Benjamin at Shiloh in Judges 21:15 through 24 is one of the clearest examples. In chapter 20, Benjamin is cast as a foreign enemy, nearly annihilated by Israel in a war that reads like conquest. In chapter 21, however, Benjamin is both integrated and held apart. The survivor sees wives at a Yahweh festival in Shiloh, tethering themselves genealogically to Israel and Yahweh, but they are then told to return to the land of Benjamin. Their distinctiveness is preserved even as they are folded into the collective. In the span of 2 chapters, Benjamin is remembered as both enemy and kin, outsider and tribe of Israel. This juxtaposition need not be accidental. It reflects the dynamics of textual layering, where the very act of juxtaposition stages multiplicity without reconciliation. The placement of chapter 20 next to 21 preserves competing visions of Benjamin's place within Israel without reconciling them. The effect is to make Benjamin's identity permanently unstable, both inside and outside, both other and brother. This is a literary technique of survival. By leaving the contradiction unresolved, the text allows different communities to find themselves in its story, whether they needed to emphasize Benjamin's otherness or its belonging. This is where I think Leonard Fleckman's category of entanglement can be strengthened by a more precise theoretical vocabulary. 2 social theorists, Rogers Brubaker and Frederick Cooper, have pointed out that even the word identity, a word we often use without thinking, is slippery. It collapses too many distinct processes, self-understanding, external categorization, group solidarity, into one vague term, and it smuggles in modern associations of ethnicity and nationhood, implying stable, bounded groups where none existed. They propose instead to speak of identification, self-understanding, and commonality. Leonard Fleckman's emphasis on entanglement already resists the fixity of identity. Brubaker and Cooper push us further by showing that what often looks like a single identity is in fact a shifting interplay of acts of categorization, practices of belonging, and forms of commonality. Processes that, like Leonard Fleckman's entanglement, keep belonging unstable, relational, and therefore always contested. Seen through that lens, Judges 21 is not about a timeless Benjaminite identity. It is about contested processes of identification and commonality. In chapter 20, Benjamin is identified as a foreign foe, a pure polity to be destroyed. In chapter 21, Benjamin is re-identified as one of the tribes of Israel, socially linked through forced intermarriage with Yahweh worshippers at Shiloh. At the same time, its autonomy is preserved through its return to the land of Benjamin. The scribes have staged both inclusion and exclusion, binding Benjamin to Israel and Yahweh while maintaining its separateness. Now let me turn to the third question, which asks how objects and text relate in reconstructing the past. Leonard Fleckman is especially sensitive here. She notes that the Shephelah is one of the most intensely excavated regions in the world. Archaeologists have uncovered major sites like Tel Batash, Azekah, Lachish, Timnah, and Gath, each with rich material records, pottery assemblages, fortifications, destruction layers. These finds have fueled decades of debate about who controlled the region, Philistine polities on the coast or Judah in the highlands, and about the identities of the people who lived in between. Leonard Fleckman resists simple answers. For her, pots and walls are not self-explanatory. Like texts, they are fragments, open to competing interpretations. And so she proposes what she calls a kaleidoscope method. Keep turning the lens, shifting perspectives between archaeology and text, never settling for a single seamless picture. That is a profound methodological contribution, but I would extend it in two directions. First, archaeology and text are incomplete in similar ways. Both survive as fragments because they were reused. A potsherd endures because it was discarded into a new stratum. A text fragment survives because a scribe reframed it in a new narrative. Neither offers transparent access to the past. Both are residues of processes, compositional and depositional. They already involve negotiation, reinterpretation, and survival. Archaeology, like text, is not neutral recovery. It too writes histories from remains. Second, following Leonard Fleckman's own refusal of seamless synthesis, I want to stress that what matters is not harmonization, but friction. The real insight comes from when we let objects and texts rub against one another. Their differences are not obstacles. They are where meaning emerges. Consider Leonard Fleckman's treatment of the Samson cycle. The archaeological record of the Shephelah highlights powerful sites like Gath and Ekron with their massive fortifications and distinct ceramic forms. Yet the Samson stories avoid those centers. Instead, they play out in liminal spaces, Timnah, Gaza, the Sorek Valley, and they figure women as embodiments of those shifting landscapes. Archaeology names pots, texts craft ambiguity. Both are acts of history making, but they generate very different maps of the past. And if we widen that lens beyond the Shephelah, we see the same dynamic at Horvat Tevet in the Jezreel Valley. Excavators have presented its later levels as the center of a royal estate, a kind of regional storehouse where royal officials collected and controlled agricultural produce, but the site's earlier remains suggest an ordinary village. The shift to large-scale storage looks gradual, uneven, and even contested. Was it a royal estate, a village, or both? The material record stages that irresolution, just as the texts do. This, I think, is the deepest point. Archaeology gives us stones, texts give us stories. Neither is the whole truth. But when we resist flattening them into synthesis, when we attend to the friction between their fragments, we catch sight of something richer. We see that both objects and texts were already curated remains, already sites of reuse, contradiction, and survival. And in that friction, pots against prose, walls against words, we begin to understand how ancient communities not only lived in landscapes of entanglement, but also remembered and reimagined them. Let me draw these reflections to a close by pausing again to appreciate the extraordinary contribution of Leonard Fleckman's book. What she has given us is not simply another study of the Shephelah, but a new vocabulary for approaching the past itself. With irresolution and entanglement, she names what many of us sense but often hesitate to foreground, that the past, whether approached through pots or prose, never congeals into a stable picture. It flickers, refracts, and resists our attempts at closure. To insist on that complexity and to offer tools for inhabiting it with intellectual honesty is no small achievement. What I've tried to add is that these categories, irresolution, entanglement, do not belong only to us modern interpreters. They were in some sense strategies of the scribal process itself. The biblical corpus is not only full of contradictions because history left it that way, it is full of contradictions because the very practices of textual reuse and compilation preserve them. Through the practices of reuse and compilation, fragments were joined without smoothing, multiplicity was staged rather than suppressed, ambiguity was preserved, and as a result, these texts remain meaningful across generations. Contradiction, multiplicity, fragmentariness, these are not obstacles to history making, but its very medium. They function as what Derrida calls traces, marks of absence and presence that sustain tradition precisely by refusing closure. This is, I think, where Leonard Fleckman's kaleidoscope image is so apt. When we peer through it, we do not see a single picture of the Shephelah or of Israel or of Philistia. We see fragments reassembled into shifting designs. But if we press further, we might say that the scribes built their texts as kaleidoscopes from the start. They knew that tradition endures not through coherence, but through polyphony. They allowed the glass to remain broken because only then could it be turned, reoriented, and made to shine anew. Our task is not to strip away those seams in search of a singular or real past, but to recognize that the seams themselves are the point. The unresolved tensions, the doubling of perspectives, the friction between text and object, these are not flaws to be corrected, but the very material of biblical memory. To read responsibly is to let the contradictions stand, to see how they were curated as acts of survival, and to ask how they continue to shape the ways we imagine community, belonging, and history itself. Leonard Fleckman has given us a language to honor this complexity. I would only add that scribes, long before us, already spoke of that language in their own idiom. Our privilege and our challenge is to listen closely enough to hear it and to recognize that act of listening, to recognize in that act of listening how contradiction itself became a language of survival.
Jonathan, thank you so much for your very poetic and intriguing comments that I'm sure have given Mahri lots to think about. Very good. Thank you so much. Our third panelist is Tawny Holm. Tawny, I'm going to turn it over to you and look forward to your comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much to the Catholic Biblical Association for bringing us all together. And thank you and congratulations to Mahri on this a wonderful book. In your erudite and thoughtful book, Scribal Representations and Social Landscapes of the Iron Age Shephelah, Mahri reminds us that history is an unresolved scribal art. As scholars of the Hebrew Bible, we indeed deal with the disembodied text, to use Bill Schneidewin's words, whose composition and textual histories are largely unrecoverable and our theories about it unverifiable. In the face of this state of affairs, Professor Leonard Fleckman's stance is to cease viewing that as a terrible problem and to instead embrace the possibilities of insight to be found in irresolution as a practice, a self-aware and conscious methodology that allows the text to offer shifting landscapes of approach. She contends that such a methodology both productively constrains and liberates. It forces one to confront with honesty the limits of what they or anyone can ever know about Israel's past, while allowing one freedom to see the varied perspectives offered within a text alongside the haunting resonance in the varied interpretations of it over the years into the present. This approach is concerned less with the usual take on scribalism, that is, the training of scribes, their scholarly milieu, the development of scripts, etc., and more on scribal approaches to the past and the narratives themselves. Her case studies demonstrating the value of this approach involve stories about two sites of the Shephelah, that is, the lowland between the coastal regions and the Judean hill country, a region which she considers, I think she seems to consider, an inherently liminal space. The biblical sites chosen are Tel es-Safi, Gath, and Timnah, both because they can plausibly be connected to a contemporary site and because the narratives in which they appear recount people's lived lives and social interactions, as opposed to a site such as Beth Shemesh, whose people only appear in the metonym, Beth Shemesh, meaning the people of Beth Shemesh. In this review panel, we are asked to reflect on three larger questions that are engaged in Mahri's book. What kinds of tensions are inherent in historical critical work? What are ethical and responsible ways to engage with issues of ancient identity? And how do objects relate to texts in understanding or reconstructing the past? My comments address parts of these issues. They're rather loosely organized musings on the topics she brings up in her book. With regard to tensions of historical critical work, I think Professor Leonard Fleckman paints a fairly comprehensive portrait of the tensions involved in the historical criticism of the Hebrew Bible. Moreover, her writing style is both vivid and precise, and the footnotes alone mark her broad interest and close familiarity with the overarching aspects of literary and historical criticism of the Bible and other texts. Resonating, evocative words such as mosaic and landscapes are frequently used. I was looking to find my favorite word, tapestry, in there, but I didn't see tapestry. But these are the kinds of evocative and informative words that really illustrate her approach. I appreciate her recognition and elucidation of particularly these factors, the following factors, in reading the text with critical history in mind. First of all, I appreciate her view that history is a narrative shaped by scribes at each telling. As she describes it, there is an ongoing tension between history with a capital H as a discipline, history, meaning historiography, the writing about the past, and the continuous dialogue between the two. This goes hand in hand with her emphasis on composition history as a mosaic, citing Brennan Breed on the coterminous nature of production and reception. Writing and reshaping moves history to the realm of literature. Such a view comports well with the work of recent textual critics as well. Eugene Ulrich and others have their work rejects the classical model of a single ur text or vorlage for each preserved edition of a text, and instead embraces concepts such as literary growth and textual fluidity with core traditions that are shaped anew each time they are told, whether that's in orally or in writing or in art and iconography, really. Next, the author Mahri thinks that historical criticism or critical history are becoming irrelevant to many scholars, and that, to quote, "We are losing the sense of a viable and relevant connection to the Iron Age itself," which the author feels may become permanent. I think this may be true in some cases, but to me, an important and related concern as part of historical criticism. My concern is that I perceive in some sense a shift away from wrestling with the original languages. To be a trustworthy translator of the biblical text, one must work to learn classical Hebrew and Aramaic with the goal of knowing them as well as possible, despite our distance of thousands of years from those scribal worlds. We need to suitably comprehend the narratives enough to unlock the shifting perspectives we're looking for. And I'm not claiming here that there's one meaning to a word or a text, or that only scholars who know the languages own the biblical text, but simply that some meanings are more likely than others. Words in all languages have shifting meanings over time, and doing one's best to understand what's possible in the ancient language at a given approximate point will make any shifting perspectives perceived within a text retain the connection to what was real. The Bible's a translated text for most people, and the translators of it must be trustworthy. So that is an area of historical criticism that perhaps there is some movement away from that in biblical scholarship. Next, Scribal Representations, the book, perfectly reminds us that each generation's view of the biblical text illuminates the present and all its concerns. What is of interest in the text to us now is not what was of interest in the past or what will be of interest in the future. Something we see in it speaks to our present, or else we simply ignore it. For example, here, I would point out the books of Chronicles. They were considered redundant and subordinate accounts of the Israelite or Judahite past under the monarchies. Before the 1990s, foregrounded them as alternative scribal perspectives on the books of Kings, and Chronicles as books whose composition and textual history is equally as interesting and complicated as that of Kings. I, for one, and this is just merely amusing, an observation, I, for one, find it very humbling to realize that I'm fixed in time and a text is not. Its ancient space flows on as long as people are reading it and engaged in what it means for them. On the second question of ethical and responsible ways to engage with issues of ancient identity, here I would say that I think recent scholars, and Mahri in her book, have largely dealt recently quite sensitively with issues of identity, which in this case involves especially the big questions of Philistine and Phoenician identity and whether or not those who we call by those names ever thought of themselves as such. Moreover, I find very sensitive her treatment of the biblical narratives, the discussion of biblical narratives in the book involving the characters who are the other in one setting but belong to the group in another. This flexibility of identity, I find, for my part, I find very sensitive in her book. What it did remind me of is that it seems to me that biblical scribes in their narratives reflect on their own status as outsiders and insiders as well. Israelites, Judahites in the Bible are conquerors as well as subjects of the great powers, Egypt, Mesopotamian powers. They are also new arrivals as well as exiles and deportees. They are wandering Aramaean foreigners as well as native people in their homeland. As we read these narratives about past lives in the Shephelah, to me, it is that larger context, the fact that the Hebrew Bible as a whole is largely a body of competing collective memories of the past, full of nostalgia for the past that once was or may have been, that really looms large. The idea of a whole set of collective memories regarding identity of Israelites and Judahites. The book emphasizes social landscapes and the landscapes of bodies, particularly those of Shephelah women, as liminal spaces. These indeed are ethical questions with great import for those who read the text today. But here I'm eager to hear Professor Leonard Fleckman's thoughts on whether the Shephelah is inherently liminal, as it may be treated in the book, and especially prone to shifting identities. Is it more geographically liminal than the sites of the hill country? For example, Jerusalem shifts its identity in the Bible. It's Jebusite, then it's conquered, and it's Jerusalem and the capital of Israel. Tel Batash or Timnah, which is located in a region with historically flexible borders and seems to have changed hands, Judean, Philistine, and back several times, it may indeed be liminal in a geographical sense, but it is hard to think this about Tel es-Safi, Gath, the narratives about which are tied to Jerusalem and the rising King David. Perhaps Gath is liminal in the David stories because David there is liminal. He's first a servant to and soldier under King Saul, whose daughter he marries. But due to his father-in-law's penchant for murdering him, he joins the Philistine enemy as a mercenary and only returns to lead the Israelites once his new associates kill Saul on an occasion at which David is mysteriously not present. But so David's participating in liminality, but was the city of Gath itself liminal? Are other sites in the Shephelah, such as Beth Shemesh, Ekron, etc., liminal due to their geographical location? In Mahri's book, she discards Beth Shemesh early on as a case study since it has no narrative to speak of. But I wonder if the one biblical story featuring Ekron, which has to do with identity and othering, although not necessarily anything to do with liminality, the stories about Ekron might also be included in these stories of the Shephelah. And I think here of 2 Kings 1, 2 through 17, it's part of the Elijah mosaic, wherein King Ahaziah falls off the roof of his palace and sends messengers to Ekron to get an oracle from the god there. The dominant scribal perspective seems to be one of mockery. The Ekron god that Ahaziah appeals to, Baal-Zebul, Baal the prince, is described in the text as Baal-Zebub, Lord of the Flies or something like that. Is there not a god in Israel? Seems to be the implication of the scribes, of course, and what they're writing. There's Yahweh, of course. So Ahaziah justifiably dies of his wounds and his brother takes the throne. The rejection of one's local god for the reviled god of the others is to identify with the other, and that's a big mistake for Ahaziah. Although the story about Ekron does not involve common lives, it does involve people and relationships about them or between them. Moreover, it's an instance where we have at least a couple substantive texts in the local voice. The royal Ekron inscription in Phoenician that mentions 5 rulers, 2 of whom we know from Assyrian accounts. And we also have the letter of Adon to Pharaoh, found at Saqqara, first thought to be a letter in Phoenician, but now understood to be Aramaic, the language of diplomacy. In the letter, King Adon, almost certainly from Ekron, begs Egypt for help against the Babylonians in perhaps around 604, 603 BCE. And in this letter, Adon blesses the Egyptian king by Baal Shemain, Ekron's main deity, and it seems to say that the Babylonians have also reached or are reaching Aphek. It's another site, presumably in the Shephelah, but it's unplaceable, and there are many different Apheks in the Bible. So for me, I wonder if thinking about Ekron would be interesting in this connection to scribal perspectives on identity in stories involving the Shephelah. The Ekron might also be lying submerged in the David stories. Achish, the name of the leader in Gath, who takes David on as the head of his bodyguard, that's the name of a king of Ekron in the days of the Neo-Assyrians. Finally, how do objects relate to text? And here I have less to say. I confess that I'm less able to address this question with anything beyond agreement with the now commonplace conclusion that pots do not equal people. This was a hard-won conclusion. Objects do not statically offer an obvious meaning on their own. They are given meaning by those who find them. Careful recording of the archaeological context and architecture, etc., is only the beginning. The archaeologists are those who read the reports, create a narrative about the past. They have to make sense of it because we seek meaning. And I would think, as I understand Mahri would think, that those writing the narrative would be consciously aware and transparent about the extent to which they utilize the texts and understand where the material record does not support them. Text and archaeology are in conversation, both are incomplete, that is to say, irresolute, to use Mahri's word. So that's all I have for my part. These are embryonic thoughts on these matters, but I want to thank Mahri for the book again and to congratulate her on engaging important key elements in the study of biblical text, historical criticism, issues of identity, and scribal representations of the past. Thanks.
Tawny, thank you so much for your very detailed comments. Again, I'm sure they're going to give Mahri lots to think about. We are going to take a very brief 5-minute break. I have 11:08, so we'll come back at 11:13 Eastern Time. Thank our 3 reviewers, and we will come back and Mahri will have an opportunity to respond to their comments and then they have an opportunity to respond to Mahri, and then we'll open up our conversation to our audience. So thank you. We'll see you at 11:13. Thank you all. Welcome back. We are here to restart our conversation, and we have heard from our 3 reviewers. We are now ready to turn it back over to Mahri for her opportunity to respond to her reviewers' comments. So Mahri, I hand it off to you.
Okay. Thank you, Archie. Thank you, Tawny, Jonathan, Rachelle, for your very, very gracious responses, first of all, and for also just the generosity of your reading, and for your really helpful critiques. I think I will not do justice to your comments in my own response, but I'll try to say a few things. I think one of the things that strikes me most about all 3 of you, your comments, is how you both kind of push things forward, like demonstrate how I can kind of be more nuanced about my own work, but also then kind of rein it in a little bit, like Tawny asking, well, is the whole Shephelah just inherently liminal in and of itself? And so that's this kind of both pushing things forward and then kind of holding things back. What are the limitations? So just a few comments for each person. And then I'd be curious to just open it up to conversation and how you all respond. I think Rachelle, first of all, she's articulated in some sense the broader history of the discipline in a way that that is really helpful even for me, the whole maximalist, minimalist conversation. I think it is important to say that people who have been called minimalists don't like that expression. That's not a self-designation. So that goes right into my own project, right? That's not how they would identify in that way. And in fact, what's interesting, with which Rachelle points out, is that, like, for example, Philip Davies, may his memory be a blessing, was deeply invested in history. I mean, in some ways, he was an utter maximalist in the way that he thought about history, which was why he was so critical about biblical texts and kind of literary texts of the Bible. Rachelle brings in a really kind of important side question about the perspective of Judahite scribes, and if we even know what Judah itself is, a category that itself changes constantly in text, which connects directly to Tawny's comment about, is this just this one area? No, it has kind of much broader implications, both for Judah itself, also for Israel. A lot of people have done a lot of work on Israel as a changing category, from Lauren Monroe and Dan Fleming, Kristen Weingart, Gary Knoppers, may he rest in peace, Omer Sergi. So these are, yes, these are all very changeable as categories. And I think lastly for Rachelle, she's really helpful in terms of like thinking about resisting my own kind of a category of how women function as landscapes, and that, that in and of itself is kind of pegging or collapsing a lot of different kinds of literary treatments of different female characters in these texts, like in the Samson narratives, which are so rich and textured in how they just talk about women. So that's really important to me in terms of kind of thinking more carefully about my own work going forward. I will also say, this is Rachelle, this is to Rachelle's comments about how I treat women. I think it also connects a little bit to Jonathan's critiques, that one of the things that I struggle with in the book is how far to go with questioning categories. And I'm pretty honest about how I do that in the book, because I think at heart, I'm not a theorist. I appreciate the practicality of needing language that works and that most people can hook into. I appreciate, for example, Aaron Maher's work on Philistine identity as an archaeologist, or Carolina Lopez Ruiz's work with so-called Phoenicians, that these categories, for example, are baked into the material, and we need to kind of attend to them. We need to contend with them and not just ditch them. So I struggle with kind of how far to go in terms of maintaining terms versus when you maintain a term and when you let it go and you try to find a new way of conceptualizing it or discussing it. Jonathan, you are a poet, first of all. Thank you. I really appreciate the way that you push my thinking further to focus on the texts themselves and how they suggest a practice of preservation that resists closure. I love your turn of language. So, for example, your statement that scribes curated contradiction because it gave the past flexibility. It allowed the text to speak across time and circumstances to remain open, contested, alive. I think that's really rich language. And I very much agree that this is the case, and that the texts resist a simple sorting. So your example, pro-monarchy versus anti-monarchy, and my work, pro-Gath versus anti-Gath, like that's very much the case. And I appreciate how you kind of push that further more explicitly in thinking about contradiction as a scribal strategy, placing contradictory texts side by side. And I wonder, actually, to be curious to hear you talk about this, but it seems to me you're talking a little bit less when you're talking about that strategy in terms of kind of the question of earlier traditions or kind of composition and more about later editing, like that this is a process of bringing things together later on. But anyway, I think this is a brilliant insight in terms of contradiction as a scribal process. I also just want to flag again Jonathan's remarkable dissertation, Fabricated Fragments, in which he really does draw this out really carefully. Love the language of friction. That's great. Letting different bodies of evidence rub up against each other. Where I become less certain and even uncomfortable, and I think you and I have talked about this before, is getting close to that fuzzy line of positing scribal intention. And you yourself are kind of, you waffle on this a little bit. Like you make a very clear statement, in your comments to me, that like we can't know the intentions of ancient scribes. But then you kind of say, scribes either do this by design or by inertia. And I'd be curious, I don't know what you mean by inertia there. I'd like to hear more about that. You also say that they use contradiction as a mode of survival. And I wonder too what that means. But at any rate, that's where I become a little bit concerned about intentionality of kind of anonymous ancient peoples, even while I completely agree that this is clearly a textual practice that we're seeing in the texts themselves. I also, lastly, appreciate the pushback against the language of identity, and this connects back to what I already said about Rachelle, which is that I struggled with this term. I ended up using it for the reasons that I express in the book. Precisely because I think it's kind of slippery and roomy as a practice, as a category of practice rather than a category of theory, even though theorists like Brubaker are incredibly compelling in their reasons not to use it. So I ended up using it. And in some ways, maybe too, because this is a word that we can all understand. We're all, Peter Brooks has this wonderful book called Peter Brooks. He's at Princeton. He wrote this book called Enigmas of Identity. And it's all about the kind of modern obsession with identity. And, sometimes one of my thinking, how I think about the contemporary historian is, I'm clearly writing this book in some sense because I care about identity, because I too am obsessed with identity, because I'm part of this modern world. But you're right, this is not necessarily something that we can kind of project onto the past or use as a clear term there. Lastly, Tawny, I really appreciate the recognition of the importance of ancient languages themselves. I think that is crucial. And it reminds me of like Benno Landsberger's very kind of infamous article potentially problematic article, Die Eigenbegrifflichkeit der babylonischen Welt, or what we commonly translate as the conceptual autonomy of the Babylonian world, which was at its time trying to kind of push back against Assyriology becoming kind of a second-class citizen to the Bible, but where he, famously argues that we need to be able to enter a language fully in order to encounter as much as possible the past, like the conceptual spaces of the past. And so that your comments remind me of that. As for the Shephelah as a whole, as more liminal, you're absolutely right. I mean, no, the Shephelah as a whole is not more liminal. It's really site-specific, and sites that are more closely inland or more closely connected to what we would call kind of at least archaeological, remains that connect more closely to the highlands, and things that are more close to the coastal plain connect more closely to what's happening in the coastal plain. And my aim is not to suggest that every site is liminal in and of itself, but rather that the categories that we use are still problematic. So the word Philistine, Judahite, Israelite. And so that, just to kind of clarify that, although, it seems to me that because that was a question, that's something that I could have potentially worked a little bit more in the book to kind of articulate at the outset. The two sites that I'm working with, Timnah is really betwixt and between, like you yourself say. Gath is not. It is what we would call a Philistine site, but then the question is, well, what does that even mean? What does that word Philistine even mean? This is where I really appreciate, both Aaron Mayr's work, but also his language, and Jonathan, like, it's his language, entanglement, communities of practice. That's people like Aaron Mayr and some other, like Philip Stockhammer and other people as well. Ekron, and lastly, Ekron is really interesting. It didn't really fit into this particular project because I was wanting to engage with spaces, like texts that talked about communities, right, and kind of like society on the ground. But kind of going back and reading the inscriptional evidence from your comments, taking a look again at 2 Kings, none of these texts, neither the ones that are in the local voice nor Kings, ever calls Ekron like Philistine. It's not a term that exists there. So I find that actually really interesting, and something that I think really very much could be done more with, particularly because, as you say, it's such a treasure to actually have some of these places where we have things that come from the local voice, as you say, like the local, perspective and language. So that was really rich for me to think about. And lastly, I'll just say one thing I've been struggling with is just the over-romanticization of some of the language, the terms that we come up with. So, I've brought up this word irresolution, or like liminality. And my aim is to broaden our methods and kind of the ways that we can work with the past. But I wouldn't want these terms to become buzzwords in and of themselves, which would then kind of paradoxically re-narrow our perspective. And so that's something that I struggle with. And also, again, just the fact that the historical practice is, we are coming from our contemporary perspective. So again, like thinking about issues of identity, irresolution, this is all based on where we are right now, in a way, in our field, in the world. Will people care about this, engaged in this work 20 years from now, 50 years from now? I don't really know. But I appreciate some of more, like Michel Desserteau's work. He's an intellectual historian. Just on this is again where a good reminder that everything is it's open, it's left open, and our job as historians, we create this false sense of closure, as if we've come to the end of our work, but really our practice is always continuing, and it's the process itself that is really meaningful, I think, for us as scholars. So those are some of my comments. Again, thank you all so much for attending to the book and for your critiques and your insights.
Thank you, Mahri. So we'll give opportunity now to Tawny and Jonathan if they want to respond to Mahri's comments, and then we'll turn it over to an open discussion. So Tawny, Jonathan.
Yeah. So just to go through some of Mahri's points. So in terms of what you first brought up, what do I mean by inertia? By inertia, what I mean is the tendency of a textual tradition to preserve contradictions simply because scribes copied, transmitted, or recombined early materials without harmonizing them. So it's not the same as a conscious like scribal strategy. It's like a probabilistic byproduct of textual transmission in a culture that valued preservation and reuse. Like any doublets in Samuel and Kings, they survive not because someone said, hey, let's keep contradiction, but because scribes lacked the impulse or maybe they resisted the impulse to harmonize things. And I'm thinking also of like the Akkadian commentary tradition where scribes often juxtapose variants or glosses or explanations without necessarily erasing inconsistencies. So it's a mode of preservation that's probabilistic for me. And the scribal art is not necessarily deliberate. It's not deliberate contradiction, but it's a sort of like a cultural tolerance for unresolved multiplicity. And when I spoke about a mode of survival, what I meant is contradiction itself becomes part of how texts remain usable across generations, especially thinking about the divide that so many biblical scholars are fixated on, the post-monarchic or the exilic period and pre-exilic or even Hellenistic, these different contexts. So it's sort of allowing it to remain usable across generations, thinking of Chronicles as well that Tawny mentioned. But a harmonized text fixes meaning in a contradictory one, allows multiple communities to read themselves into it over time. So those are just a few of the points I wanted to clarify.
Well, I appreciated Mahri's comments and then also the other reviewers' comments on all of these issues that we're engaged in addressing today. And again, this is our place in time. These are the things that interest us now. And 10 years from now, who knows what will be the new things. But I do appreciate, Mahri, your point that we shouldn't allow these terms, liminality, irresolution, to become buzzwords and then close off conversation. Because I do agree with you that frequently happens. Here's the take of now. Here's the stance of now. But on the other hand, that also creates a space for, again, friction with upcoming scholars who then say, no, that's not right. Here's the way you need to expand this, and push back against the old paradigm. So, this underscores our continuous engagement as scholars with all these matters that impact our reading of a text. I appreciate that you brought up Benno Landsberger in the conceptualization of Mesopotamia, Babylonia. And again, Aaron Mayer's entanglement language about Gath. So that does help me understand where you're coming from in your book when you're thinking about Gath and Timnah specifically. Timnah and Gath, I guess they both have this geographical liminality, but in a very different sense. Timnah changes hands back and forth. Gath is Philistine, but it has entanglements with the society around it. So that's why the stories of David really match what we know about Gath, especially from the archaeology. So that's a really wonderful clarification. And you're right. When we're talking about Ekron and a story in Second Kings about Ahaziah, and even the writings from Ekron, they're not using the word Philistine, which again, is part of the whole conversation about what does Philistine mean? Who are Philistines? Is there a coherence to using that term? Did they think of there being a coherence? And it's fairly complicated. My colleague here at Penn State, Ann Killebrew, you cite her work on ethnicity, and she works on both Philistine identity and Phoenician identity. And these are all really interesting questions. Yeah, that's my response to Mahri. To Jonathan, I really like your discussion of identity and how complicated it really is. We know this is of great concern in our modern world, how people are identified by others, how they identify themselves, and it shifts all the time. The explanation of who someone is depends on the context, even for the person themselves. Who am I in respect to this? Who am I in respect to that? And you're citing Brubaker and Cooper is excellent. That excellent study is important for deciding how to use terms, identity, identification, or what you're going to do. Thanks.
One thing I wanted to add was in terms of in my reading of Mahri's book, I did not really see her using the anthropological category of liminality so much. And I feel like she was arguing that the Shephelah is not liminal in any strict sense, because that implies that there's a fixed center and a periphery. And instead, she did use the zone of entanglement where practices blur and overlap. So just to me, if we do talk about liminality and what it could be like useful and shorthand in a conversation, but as Mahri was suggesting to all of us, it does risk stabilizing what Mahri wants to keep unstable. The point is that the Shephelah is not that it is an in-between zone, and exposes how categories themselves are unstable for her. At least that's how I read it. Everything's constructed, staged, and refracted. That's why entanglement is a great metaphor, and liminality is less useful.
I will just say, like, last comment too, is that, again, I keep using the word struggle, but there's a part of me that's like fairly conservative. Like, I am not an utter relativist. I care very much that there was a past, like real people doing real things. And again, there's a practical element for me of, I don't want to destabilize. I mean, in some ways, it's very good to critique all these categories that we have, but we also need them very practically in our daily life. There's a reason why we, as human beings, have categories to begin with. So again, it's a kind of there's a tension there. There's another kind of sense of friction there, I think, Jonathan, to use your word.
Just as a reminder, those of you out in the virtual audience, if you have a question, you can post it in the chat, and you can use the Zoom feature to raise your hand, and we can call upon you to read your question, or we can read it for you. Don't be afraid. We won't scare you, or nobody in the panel is going to scare you. But feel free to ask away, and we will call upon you, or we will read your question for you.
As we wait, just to go back to the topic of identity, I think us as, I mean, if we want to call ourselves historians of antiquity, of the Iron Age, it's a great place to sort of problematize this category of identity, because people did move between overlapping affiliations, And it's so hard to pinpoint exactly where they are, even in space and time, movement, even movement of people like Kid, Cult, talking about empires, cities, lands, and identity is trying to resolve all this complexity into a single category. So Brubaker and Cooper are talking about identity in the modern sense and why it's a problem nowadays, but in antiquity, where even the word identity doesn't exist, we have all these other categories that are so much more useful to us. I mean, even talking about gentilics and thinking about how people identified as opposed to identity is probably a lot more useful. And I think what Mahri's book shows so clearly is that the Shephelah was a zone where those acts of belonging constantly shifted. That's why it's a great place to start thinking about how identification shifts.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jonathan. I'm gonna go back. I need to go back and read Brubaker, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great short article that sort of summarizes things really nicely.
I actually thought, Mahri, that one of the reviewers would perhaps address the lack of engaging with the current work on scribalism per se, the scribal milieu, the training of scribes, script development, dating of text via that means, and no one did. So I guess we're not uncomfortable with that, but do you want to address maybe why you went that direction? I mean, or how you think of those matters, I have to say. Yeah.
Well, it was one of my colleagues here was like asking me, I mean, this is like Bill Schneidewin's work, and what do I even mean by scribe? Like, what is that when I use this word scribe? And I think I don't mean I kind of use it as a stand-in for the practices themselves, not necessarily pinpointing scribal specific communities. And it's just not it's not my area of specialization. It's not really, other people have done this work really well in terms of like exploring very carefully what like the actual scribal practices and things like that. So it's just not, it was not really where my interests lay. My interests were more in the historical practice and kind of intellectual history and thinking about just the representation of the past and the practices of history writing. So that's where, and I think Tawny, you actually, you had a really nice way of putting that even at the beginning of your response, that I wasn't interested in, or that my focus was, I don't remember how you put it, but I thought it was a good way of coining it. I do kind of futz around dating, I think that's where, again, I'm trying to kind of, like, I was trained to be a rigorous composition historian and to posit a date, like to come down hard on a date. And so part of what I was doing in this book was to kind of perform what it's like to try to be more unresolved about that, given that we continue to argue the dating debates because they are, in the end, there are good arguments for different dates, and it's indeterminate at this point. So I was trying to kind of perform what it might look like to, not a wishy-washy way, but like a rigorous way, analyze the evidence and say, well, this could be, late, like post-exilic, or this could be pre-exilic, but we also, it's clear things changed over time and it speaks to different spaces and time. So I did try to do that a little bit. Yeah.
Well, you didn't avoid that at all. So maybe that's why no one was uncomfortable, because you really did talk about the possibility for the historical background. You did historical critical work for what you were looking at.
Yeah. Yeah.
We have a question from one of our online participants. Daniel Smith wrote in the chat, "Hi all, thank you. This has been really interesting. I'd be curious to hear a bit more from Jonathan and/or Mahri about what happens if we move in this conversation from identity to identification, self-understanding, or commonality. I'd love to hear what that language might do, and also any other reading recommendations on the topic.
Happy to jump in. So the move away from identity to terms like identification, self-understanding, and commonality, they really matter, because identity tempts us to treat belonging as stable, as I was just saying, but these alternatives, they remind us that it's a process. So identification is how others are labeling you. Self-understanding is how you're narrating yourself, and commonality is what you do together. So you can contradictions become more intelligible when we sort of start breaking apart identity into these categories. So Benjamin, like my example that I used, can be identified as an enemy in one chapter and bound in commonality to Israel in the next chapter. That makes sense. You can start thinking of that in terms of those of self-understanding versus commonality, or identification of Benjamin. So archaeology also fits into this sort of picture. So pottery doesn't really prove ethnicity, but it does trace practices of commonality in the material record. So I think that vocabulary lets us see multiplicity in our sources, not as incoherence, but as like the texture of how ancient belonging was remembered and staged. So it sort of helps pinpoint things a little bit more clearly, at least for me.
I don't have much more to add.
That's fine. We had another question coming from Lauren Monroe. Lauren writes, Mahri, I'm wondering how we are to know when irresolution is an appropriate practice, and even, as you suggest, an ethical stance or imperative. And when is it appropriate to allow ourselves as historians to imagine what the resolution might look like? Are there ethical compromises involved in the historical practice of resolution?
Thanks so much, Lauren, for that question. It's good to see you here, by the way. And I really, this is, I think, an important question, because not everything is unresolved. And again, this is where I'm not a pure relativist. It's, we can make very strong claims, for example, about what we're seeing in the archaeological remains, right? Like this particular strata tells us that people were here at this time, for example, that there was a destruction at this time. These pots signal this style, for example. I think also about some of the issues that are even more arguable, but I think in the end are also can be resolved. For example, like I'm thinking about the myth of the empty land. So this whole argument about what happened, in the wake of the Assyrian conquest to the northern kingdom, and this kind of old myth that we have that the whole space was completely wiped out and all these new people came in, and those people were not Israelite, whatever word that, really means to them. And I think it's very clear that that is not true, that people continue to exist, and that there was long-term relationships, in fact, with what was happening in the South. So I think there are many ways in which it is responsible to make clear statements about what happened and what did not happen. Like there are facts here, I think, and things that we can actually, and also things we can determine from the evidence. And then there are things that I think this is where I out myself as a composition historian, because where I come to irresolution is largely from being involved in a world where people argue about the dates of biblical texts. And there are some very good arguments for different dating. But again, at the end, it's unresolved. The issue is unresolved. And I wonder sometimes what it would be like if, rather than I'm going to die on this hill, that the whole, all these texts were written in the Hellenistic period, versus I'm going to die on this hill that they date to the 10th century. If people were a little bit more open to having conversations that were not so fixed where that might actually take us as a field in a positive way, if everyone kind of culled their knowledge rather than staking out camps. So I think it's a kind of a both and space. And I'd be curious, Lauren, if you wanted to, follow up on that or say something else about that from your perspective. But thank you for the question.
Yeah, just to, to echo Mari, I think that the key is transparency, and that's what's great about this book. It's any resolution that we offer has to be marked by like the tentative probabilistic nature of the reconstruction. And I think the ethical compromise comes if we fail to signal that, right? It's not to like to foreclose possibilities of sources themselves leaves open, but we also have to leave our audiences without we can't leave our audiences without any usable past. So it's like a matter of balance. We have to live in irresolution where the source is demanded, and also to build resolution in full awareness of the costs of doing that. We have to sort of keep that in mind as scholars when we're doing any of our work, and being very sensitive to that, as opposed to sort of putting out this positivist reconstruction of history. Just having this methodological awareness is what makes the work more careful. Doesn't mean to not say anything, to not come up to, not to resolve our text, not to say anything historical.
Yeah. I'll also just say, to add to what Lauren's question, is that identity might be one of the places that most easily lends itself to thinking about irresolution. There's a reason why I chose that. Not all topics lend themselves to that in the same way. So
Yeah, I would agree that self-awareness of what you are doing is extremely important. And I myself am frequently caught out in looking at things through, well, let's just call it a patriarchal lens, or the traditional lens, or the lens I was educated in, or whatever. And for me, the biggest instance of this is when we find new texts and there's an incomplete name. The restoration is always a man's name. We are prone, all of us, to doing that. And I work on texts from Egypt. And once you look at how many women are all over the place in the elephantine texts, you think, oh my goodness, what is our problem? What is our problem? There are women storehouse managers, women who are temple officiants and stewards or whatever. Why did I so wholly absorb that lesson that I was looking for men? How the heck did that happen, that I need to shake myself and get out of that? And it's shocking to me in my own part, to have fallen for that.
I think I was called out a little by Rachelle, actually, in my kind of Women as Landscapes chapter, that there were ways in which I was actually potentially stereotyping more than the texts themselves do, like without even being aware that I was doing that, or at least I could have been more nuanced, a little bit more nuanced. So yeah, I appreciate that.
Any other comments? Well, it doesn't look like we have any more from our virtual audiences. Well, I want to thank our 4 panelists, Rachelle Gilmour, Jonathan Schmidt-Swartz, and Tawny Holm, and of course our author, Mahri Leonard Fleckman, for being with us today. So thank you, Mahri, for writing this wonderful volume. We're very happy you could join us and this opportunity to discuss your book and all the the great discussion we had and the great reviews that Jonathan, Tawny, and Rachelle gave us today in their comments and the dialogue that we had that followed. Want to remind everybody that we have 2 Unbound book reviews coming up in the next 2 months. We have one by James Barker, Writing and Rewriting the Gospels, John and the Synoptics, which will be October 22nd at 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. Eastern Time. And then also Crispin Fletcher Louis, The Divine Heart Set, November 12th at 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. also. So again, thank you all for being with us, and thank our virtual audience for being with us, and thank you to Facebook for allowing us to live stream this. So Mahri, again, thanks so much for being here, and thank you so much for writing this volume. I'm sure it's going to have a very impactful, be in a very impactful work for historical critical method and various other things in our field. So thank you so much, and thank you everybody for being here.
Thank you, Archie.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank
Joshua.
you.
Thank you, Archie.
You
Thank
all.
you, Jonathan, Mahri.
Thank you all.
Bye.